Welcome to another edition of World Talks here on TVP World. I'm your host, Benjamin Lee. Now, European leaders have gathered at Alden-Biesen Castle in Belgium for an informal summit focused on the EU's economic strength as the bloc grapples with high energy costs, tighter global trade conditions, and growing investment gaps with the United States. With former president of the European Central Bank, Mario Draghi, warning that Europe's economic situation has further deteriorated, debate is intensifying over deregulation, capital markets reform, and even a multi-speed Europe. Joining us today on TVP World to assess this is Piotr Kaczyński, EU Institutional Issues Lecturer at the European Institute of Public Administration, specializing in EU governance as well as decision-making. Hello and welcome to TVP World.
Good morning.
So a lot of the talk today is centered around the term competitiveness. Can you help us define that? What do they actually mean? Is growth, productivity, innovation, global influence?
Pretty much all of that above what you just mentioned. So the biggest problem out there is that we have three big blocs in the world that are all super hungry for the capital. We don't talk about that too much over last years where it's security-dominated landscape, but there is a race for the capital that we haven't seen in decades before. Each of those three big blocs, China, United States, and the European Union, is competing for that capital. Why do we need that capital? We need that capital for transition. So transition into what, you may say? There's AI going on. It costs a fortune. AI gigafactories in the US, they eat so much energy that it drives even more capital to build or develop those energy sources. Then you have the question about innovation. Companies, what Draghi is talking about, that there's only 7 unicorns from Europe compared to 120 from the US. Those are the topics out there.
Yeah, that's an amazing gap that you just mentioned, and this, of course, is also being discussed in Alden-Biesen. What do you think contribute to this drastic difference between just 7 unicorn startups compared to 120 in the States?
Probably a different mode, how Europeans define competitiveness and how Europeans define themselves in the future in the world. So Europeans have been largely focusing over the last 6 years or so on making sure that there's a green transition, energy transition. Energy has been the major focus here, not the digital as much. And while the Chinese predominantly, but also the Americans have been focusing so much more on the digital aspect. So we have the much greater influx of the American and Chinese competitors against the Europeans who are maybe lagging behind, or maybe it's an issue of priorities, and then on paper it looks dramatic, 120 to 7. But maybe if we look at it a bit differently, it looks much better, because there are plenty of figures where Europeans look much better than the Americans or the Chinese.
Right, it also depends on the metric you use to measure success as well, right? And speaking of looking at the number, the former Prime Minister of Italy and former President of the European Central Bank, Mario Draghi, warned of a slow economic agony. Agony is a strong word. And do you think the situation has worsened since that 2024 report?
Well, Draghi is arguing that since his report in September 2024, not much has been changed, but knowing how EU operates and how Europeans operate, the thesis that Europe's in agony or European economy is in agony doesn't refer to every single European country. Because if you look at various competitiveness indexes out there, you will have a bunch of European nations very high, much higher than the United States. The Nordics, the Eastern Bloc, especially the Baltic countries, are super competitive. Yeah. So it's not a question about that, but it is a question about scaling up. Because it's about Germany, France, Spain, Italy, Poland, and the Netherlands, the largest economies of the bloc and in the bloc that are at different speeds. And the biggest of them, Germany, is the biggest laggard. And the biggest question for that, why it's happening, is because of energy costs and also focusing on green transition or energy transition over recent years, not the digital transition that other players have been focusing on.
Right, definitely lagging behind because of energy issues, but we're also seeing a lot of finger pointed towards the over-regulating nature of the European Union. Do you think that that's something that is going to be remedied? We saw the President of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, actually address the excessive bureaucracy. But how much do you think that is kind of stifling innovation, and do you think there's any plans to actually address it somehow?
You just had a nice quote on TVP World from Bart de Wever that the Union has to be more pragmatic, otherwise the green transition rules will effectively kill the European industry. Strong words out there, but if you do talk to people who are dealing with industry, they have been arguing for many years that the rules that we have introduced in Europe on green transition are too restrictive, they are too limiting effectively on doing business. And what we have seen over last year, and this is contrary to Draghi's point from 2026 that nothing has been done, is that there's a number of processes out there in legislation that are relaxing some of those rules. So we are becoming more competitive, if you like, and those rules will allow for much more economic freedom for those big business companies, big companies out there to innovate more and spend more on research and development. Because at the end of the day, this is the one figure that is drawing Europeans down. How much private companies are investing in research and development compared to the Americans and the Chinese.
Right. We also saw the leaders citing cutting some overlapping national and EU regulations, but I'm wondering how that would be feasible with 27 different member states, and all of them have their own internal rules and then have to adhere to the European ones. Do you think that if they were to look for some ways to advance the competitiveness, there needs to be a streamlined way of doing things?
Exactly, and that's the biggest question out there, how to make the step forward. For example, the question is about the race for the capital, right? So the global markets are out there, and they are looking where to invest their money, where are the biggest profits. It happens that a lot of that capital is actually sitting in Europe, and it's not being used. And the leaders are meeting to discuss exactly how to tap into this, how to motivate the European capital, which is here, to actually start making money, if you like, not to just sit passively out there in banks or somewhere hidden. So the question is, for many years, that we need to have a capital markets union where there will be room for startups and scale-ups for those new industries to build up, not only in green economy, but also in the digital spectrum. And we have some of those, and they may not be yet unicorns, but there is Bolt bigger than Uber in a lot of places, a lot of destinations, just to mention a European and American competition in one sector, but you have so many others. Christine Lagarde, the president of the central bank, she has been talking about a need of having European unicorns in the banking sector, because we keep on using American companies such as Visa or MasterCard rather than developing a European one. So there's a lot of move, if you like, where there's a lot of countries who can contribute to this discussion, and that's what happened in this Belgian old castle in the outskirts of Brussels yesterday.
Right. Do you think that there's any way for some of these companies to catch up, or are there certain sectors that once the market is saturated with existing companies like Visa, MasterCard, for example, people are already using it? Do you think that Europe would risk playing catch up to other economies like the United States?
I think the big question is about the scale-up, because when it comes to startup, we are not doing that bad. I mean, if you go around the Union in Germany and France and Spain and Poland, you have so much innovation going up. The question is about scaling that up to a different level. Here in Poland, for example, we just saw that one of the biggest innovating companies in the new digital era, for example, in logistics, InPost, was just bought up by who? By international capital out there that is interested in rapidly developing certain companies. So InPost might be benefiting of it, but at the same time, is it still a Polish company? If you like, the big question is there.
Yeah, and what do you think that means if these Polish startups and a lot of these European companies eventually gets bought out by like big conglomerates? And when we look at the investment patterns, it also looks like Europeans are more tending towards things that are a safer investment instead of something that is more pioneering and innovative. Do you think that this is also going to create a gap when it comes to competitiveness?
The scaling up is the key question here.
Okay.
You look at Skype. I'll give you a historical example. Skype was invented where? In Estonia. Today, it's fully integrated into an American company called Microsoft and used globally within their whatever services that they provide. So it's not bringing any benefits to that country that innovation came from. It was sold off to another country, if you like. So the question is about scaling up so that those Bolts and Skypes and InPosts of today are actually becoming centers of the new industry for generation or two in the future. Because it's not only about having innovation, it's about making an industry around it and making sure that that benefits everybody on this continent.
All right, so we'll see how this will shape out and whether or not leaders in the summit will bring any sort of decision and concrete step to address this issue. But in the meantime, thank you so much for your input and insight.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you. And thank you for tuning into this edition of World Talks. But for more news, update, and commentary, please stay tuned to TVP World.